How's it going, guys? Will Robinson here from Robinson's Auto, toolsandtime.com. Welcome back. Remember a couple of videos ago, we did the heater circuit on that 2001 Chrysler Sebring with the 3.0, and I mentioned that when it came in, all the monitors were cleared. Everything was added to ECM, mainly due because of a dead battery. It had a faulty alarm system that I took care of while it was here that kept draining the battery. And instantly the heater circuits popped up because it was a hard fault. You know, I had an open in the circuit. So I tackled the heater circuit in the O2s, and that problem hasn't came back. However, a few days later he gave me a call and said that his check engine light came back on. And I warned him that this may happen because all the system was cleared before I had a chance to work on it. So it's a very dreaded scenario when this happens, so take that as a warning. However, we have a P0401, which is low flow EGR. So we're going to take a look. I'm going to show you a couple quick troubleshooting methods. This test here, I'm just going to determine if the diaphragm is good in the EGR valve. So I have my vacuum pump hooked up. I'm just going to bring it down to like 15 inches and just make sure it holds for a bit. And we'll just hold it there for a little bit. I just verified the diaphragm's good. Okay, I started doing a few things here. As you can see, I got a vacuum gauge set up. I took and I removed, I don't know if you can see back there, I took the hose off the EGR valve and have the vacuum gauge hooked up to the port that went to the EGR valve. Over here you have your EGR solenoid. This is control side switch from the ECM. So I took this off, found it to be a ground side switching circuit, so with the key on, I took and I found the outside simply by doing that. Flipped it over and it's the red wire. So the green wire is the ECM ground switch. I took and I have a pin back probing the ground side switching of the circuit. We're going to plug it into the solenoid. I got my test light hooked up to ground. As you see, I verified that when I did the voltage check. Now what this does, if you take and you follow my test light down, it goes through the light bulb and then out to this pin. What it's going to do is apply ground through this light bulb filament down to the tip of the test light. And if you listen closely, you should hear a click and my light bulb should light dimly. So we just verified that we could hear an audible sound coming from that solenoid valve. It doesn't mean it's 100% good, but we know that at least the windings in that valve are good mechanically or electrically. We don't know mechanically how that valve is operating at this point. Next, we're going to perform a test on the EGR valve solenoid. What I'm going to do is simply hook my vacuum pump up to where the vacuum supply would normally be hooked up to. When it's not energized, it should be just leaking vacuum through to the separate port. When I energize it, it should seal and hold the vacuum. I'll be using my test light to activate it. And as you can see, if I apply this to ground, you can hear it. Okay, so when it's not energized, hopefully you can see that gauge, I can pull a vacuum on it all I want, and it doesn't hold. Now if I energize it, as you can tell by the bulb lit up, if I apply vacuum, it should hold pretty well. As you see, I pulled it down around 25 and it's holding pretty good. And if I take and release the valve, it bleeds right off. So that's working correctly.
Okay, I took some time to draw up this vacuum diagram. Hopefully it'll give you a better understanding of how the system works if you need to, take some time and study this before you proceed any further. However, we're going to start right here at the throttle body. It comes in, airflow going into the engine from the air cleaner. There's no vacuum on this side of the throttle plate. This is on the air cleaner side. And if you take notice, you'll follow this vacuum line up, and it goes to the top side of the EGR solenoid. Okay? On this side of the throttle plate, it goes to your engine, and you'll have vacuum on this side of the engine, somewhere usually around 20 to 25 at idle on this side of the throttle plate. And if you follow it, this vacuum line goes to the vacuum valve. This valve here takes it from, say, 20 or 25 inches of vacuum and drops it down somewhere around 6 to 7 inches of vacuum. And sometimes in this line, as I have illustrated here, they put a little restrictor valve. And this one does have that, and it's simply a little tiny restrictor piece that's pushed inside the vacuum hose. You almost think that someone put something in there to block it. However, there is supposed to be, on some systems, a restrictor in that line. Okay, so we're coming in here at engine vacuum, say 25 inches. This valve's going to take and drop it down to 7. Okay, if you follow it all the way over, it goes to the EGR valve. The only way this EGR valve is going to start opening, because if you come here and you look, it has a T that comes off, goes up to the EGR solenoid, which is normally open. Okay, so that means when you're pulling this 6 inches of vacuum, trying to pull open this EGR valve, it's not going to open because it's coming up through this T and just taking the path of least resistance over to this side of the throttle plate where you don't have any vacuum. So your vacuum simply just short cycling right in this spot, right in that space. Now if this solenoid valve were to close, it'd be like taking this T right out of the line, and now you'd be supplying the vacuum to the EGR valve, hence opening the valve. So the only time you're going to have enough vacuum to open the EGR valve is if this solenoid closes, or you take and you pinch this line. Okay, if you need to, take some time and study this, and let's move on.
This next test is going to test the integrity of pretty much the whole system as a whole. I got the vacuum line disconnected that ran to the EGR. Now I wish I had a T to put in there, but I don't, so I apologize for that. But we just did a vacuum test on EGR, confirmed good. Diaphragm, the hose I took off, you can take my word for it, it's good. I tested it. So I got my vacuum gauge hooked up to the port that would run to the EGR valve. And if you come over here, I got my vacuum pump hooked up to the inner port E that came down. That's your supply vacuum. Came to this vacuum control valve. As you see, that inner vacuum line with the green tracer on it. Okay, that supplies the, say, 20 inches of vacuum. This control valve will lower the vacuum down to around 7, somewhere in that range. I have to look it up to be exact. Then it will come down this line. This line here runs to the EGR. However, it tees off and comes down to your control solenoid valve, which bleeds the vacuum back off to a port in the throttle body. So how this works is when this solenoid isn't energized, you'll have vacuum going to this EGR line. However, it has that T. Hopefully you can see it back there. It has a T that comes off that line. And pretty much if you took that line off, you lose your vacuum. So that's what this EGR solenoid does. The vacuum goes from that T to the bottom of the EGR solenoid, out the top, and this line pretty much vents back to the throttle body. So when this isn't energized, the vacuum is just flowing through the lines. It's not enough to pull open the EGR. And when this solenoid valve closes, it's pretty much plugging this back line with the T on it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I got the key on. I'm going to take and apply vacuum And as you can see, that valve is open. I guess I have the wipers on as well. As you can see the vacuum gauge fluctuating very little. And I'm not gaining on it. That's because that solenoid valve isn't closed. So I got my test light, and we're going to apply that to the ground just like so. As you heard, it should be closed. And now we're going to test it. And remember, it's going to have 20 inches on this gauge. I'm going to bring this down to 20. However, that gauge should only go up to around 7 or so. As you can see, it stopped right around 7. I actually pulled this one down around 25. You can see it's holding pretty well. I'm going to take and disconnect the solenoid valve. And release the vacuum. So what I want to do first is a snap throttle test to see if the ECM is controlling this valve correctly. When you start it up at idle, that ground should trigger at snap throttle. Okay, so what I'm going to use for this test, this is like what they call a logic style test light. It uses the LED, so it doesn't put much of a load on the circuit at all. It doesn't test the entire integrity, but I will see if that ground is switching at snap throttle, because that LED should light up green. Pretty much I got it hooked up to the positive. If I touch ground, it should light up green. Okay, so you can see what I got here. I got a back probe, got the alligator clip hooked on, got my test light hooked up. So when I snap the throttle, you should see that LED flash. So that's telling us that the computer is sending the ground. Not sure how it's acting under a load. I really don't want to hook up my test light because it has a pretty heavy filament in it. A lot more than what that winding is, and I don't want to take a chance of damaging the ECM. So what I'm going to do is simply hook up my meter. Okay, I don't have my other meter with me today, so I'm using the sand clamp style. But as you can see, I got it hooked up to ground. I'm going to take and hook this side up to the ground switching. And what you'll see is that it'll read battery voltage. Hopefully you can see that, 13.7. Well, the reason why you're reading that is because this ground isn't switched right now, so we're not pulling it down. So we got 12 volts or 13 volts going to the solenoid valve. It's going through the windings and coming back out the ground side. Okay? And that's why we're reading that 13 volts. It's actually going through the coil in that solenoid and coming out the ground. So if I take and I pull that ground down, that would drop. And let me demonstrate that. So if I back probe, if I touch that back probe on the solenoid valve, it should apply a ground, close that valve, and I should see vacuum. So I'm going to take and touch it, and as you can see, our vacuum dropping. Pretty slow, but it is dropping nonetheless. See the gauge dropping? See how my meter dropped down about 5 volts? 5.9, somewhere around there. It's not dropping down to 0 because I'm using the test light, so it's not all going to ground. But as you can see, it dropped down about 5 volts, and that's enough to close that valve. When I snap this throttle, we should see that same drop or something similar on that meter. So okay, I'm going to snap the throttle. See that? so we know the computer, the ECM, is working correctly and triggering that ground. Just to go over it one more time, this one line here runs back to where I have that vacuum line connected. That usually goes to the EGR. This line here runs back, and that's this inner one. So the one to our right is the one that's supplying vacuum over to this valve, and this drops the vacuum down to probably around 7 inches, I would say, somewhere around there. So we're putting vacuum to this top line, but it's coming through this solenoid valve. Solenoid valve is not energized, so it's just leaking through and going back to the other port, so it's not putting vacuum on this line. So what we could do, we could either take this off the bottom, maybe I'll do that first. I'm just going to put my finger over it, and it's pretty much going to block this vacuum leak, and we should see vacuum on that gauge. So I'm going to take and block it. As you see, we're getting vacuum. It should be much faster than that. Right around 6.5, 7 inches. Okay. I tell you, that's a slow response. I was expecting to see a much faster vacuum response. And this is taking the solenoid valve out of the equation. I think we should see that vacuum within a second. I'll have to go double check, but I'm almost certain. Let's see if we're getting that same response through the solenoid valve. Now I have a hook back up, and simply, instead of me putting my finger over it, this solenoid valve is going to close, and it should do the same thing. Ready? As you see, it's going down. That's just very slow. And we're getting about the same amount of vacuum through it, around 6.5. Okay, so now I know I'm getting 6.5 through this whole system. I want to see what kind of vacuum I have up to this valve. So what we could do is take off that right vacuum line with the green tracer on it and see what kind of vacuum we have on that port. So we're going to come over here and disconnect that vacuum line. We're going to hook our vacuum gauge up to it and check our vacuum response. So I'm going to get it hooked up, and we're going to see how quick that goes up to 15. See how slow that's going? That should have been up to 15 within 1 second. So I'll do that one more time. Try to get it all in the frame for you. Make sure I'm on there good. Okay, we're on. And as you can see, it's taking way too long. Okay guys, what I did next, I took and I hooked up my vacuum line to this EGR vacuum port, and it's very restricted. When I blow through it, I try to blow through it with my mouth, I can barely get any pressure through it. So I'm going to try taking and spraying some cleaner down that port. Okay, I wish I had the camera rolling on that one. However, I think I just found our problem, and it may be corrected now. What I did, remember earlier I said I hooked up a vacuum line to this and I tried blowing through this port for the EGR, and I could barely get anything to pass. Well, what I did, I went down to the hardware store and I got the smallest bit that I could possibly find, the smallest drill bit. Now, remember, this is still too big to fit through that bottom port, but I should be able to get down to at least a throttle body. And when I first stuck this in that port, I tried it with a bigger drill bit earlier, and I could tell there was stuff in there because it was soft. However, I didn't want to try to force a bigger bit too far down, so I went and got this small bit to 1 millimeter, I believe. Is that a number 60? When I did, I put it in there and I just turned it with my fingers, and this black stuff started coming out. I'm not sure if it was carbon or if it's the inner of the hose starting to come apart. Maybe it's getting soft and deteriorating. However, that's what I think it might have been. But remember, this vacuum port is always flowing through this solenoid valve, sucking from this other port. So this one here is drawing vacuum. So it's constantly circulating vacuum, so it might have been picking up carbon over time. However, I got that most of it out until I felt the drill bit bottom out. And remember, I was only spinning it with my fingers. You know, kind of just like so. And see how far down I'm in there now? I couldn't even get it like past this point. That's how bad it was. And I just did it until I felt it hit the throttle bite, and then I stopped. And I just flushed it out. And now it's pretty free flowing. You know, still a little restriction because it's a very small port, but it's pretty large down to that point. So this bit will fit down until it bottoms out, and then you don't want to force it any further. And once I did that, I put the hose back on it, and I could blow through it nice and free. So I'm going to start putting these hoses back together that I removed to gain access, and then we'll see what kind of vacuum response we have. Okay guys, we're back after the port has been cleaned out. We're going to do that same vacuum response test. So we're looking for it to get to at least 15 within 1 second. So hopefully I'm getting it all in the frame. I want you guys to see the whole thing. Right, I'm getting ready to touch it. Bam. Again, 1, 2, 3. It's getting there within a second. So I believe we got it fixed. So let's put it all back together and see what we got to the EGR. Okay, so now we know that that's good. I got the vacuum hose hooked back up. So we're going to come over here and test the vacuum control valve. Pretty much this just lowers the vacuum for the EGR. We know the black with the green tracer, it's a supply vacuum. So we want to disconnect the vacuum line from this side and check the vacuum right at this port. So it's going in to the control valve and out. This vacuum here should be anywhere from 6.3 to 7.1. We know we had 20 over there, around 20. So we're going to see if this thing's doing its job and dropping it down. So 6.3 to 7.1. As you can see, we're at 7 point something. So we're at the high end, but it's doing its job. Okay, now all our vacuum lines are hooked back up. The only one that's remaining off is the short piece that goes from this port to the EGR. So what I'm going to do is hook my vacuum gauge up to that port, and we're going to do that snap throttle test and see if we have a response now. I hooked my vacuum gauge up to the port that would go to the EGR valve. What I do notice now is that I got like 1.5 inches of vacuum. But what I do know by reading some data is that it has to be over 2 in order to even start opening the EGR. So what that's telling me is that I got a little restriction in this valve. Let's see, I could pull the top off and it still remains. So even with the top off, so you know it's not a plugged port here. But if I remove it from the bottom side of the solenoid, the vacuum drops to 0. So what we're seeing is the restriction in the pintle of this valve. Because we know it only closes when it's energized. And we know it's not energized. I'll show you what it does. Let me energize it. Remember, if we just tap it. Alright, I'm going to tap it. See how much quicker that response is now, guys? Less than a second. It goes above 7. I can already tell we got it fixed. so the engine's got to be warm. If it's below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, this test, it won't respond on the snap throttle test. It'll just sit where it's at. So I should be able to see this go above 3 with a quick burp with a snap of the throttle. Ready? Hopefully you've seen that. We weren't seeing any response before. Okay, so now we have all the vacuum lines reinstalled. The complete EGR system is all hooked back up. This thing's going to need a belt, so I don't mind that chirping. I wish I had a T to put in that EGR supply line, vacuum supply line, and I could show you with the gauge. But as you can tell, it's idling fine. You're not going to hear nothing on the snap throttle. But I would be able to show you that it is working, and we verified that already. But what I can show you is I'm going to activate it with the test light hooked up to ground and listen to the difference in idle. This is how you check your EGR passages. See how it pretty much stalls the vehicle? One more time, you'll see the light. We just verified that our EGR system's working. Okay, I just got back from a short test drive. I only put about 10, 15, maybe 20 miles on it at the most. But as you see, I just did a scan. No codes present. I just want to see if it did the EGR monitor test. So we'll see what ones complete it, if any. I didn't go through the complete drive cycle yet. I just wanted to close this one out. It's getting pretty late. So, look at that. So we have some that are not complete, but the ones that are complete, I want to point out, is the oxygen sensor heater monitor is complete, and the EGR system monitor completed. Misfire completed, fuel system monitor completed, and comprehensive component monitoring completed. Our EGR went through its drive cycle already. We're just waiting on the other ones to complete the inspection. I just want to show you that to verify the fix.